Hi, I'm Claire. Today, myself and my fellow group members, Tia and Kailey, will be providing a presentation focused on Section 4.0 of the Professional and Ethical Compliance Code. The first half of our presentation will provide a comprehensive review of the contents of subsections 4.06 to 4.11 of the code. The second half of our presentation will be a role play demonstrating an ethical dilemma focusing on subsection 4.10. We will finish the presentation by outlining the underlying moral philosophy and relevant Ontario legislation to the ethical dilemma presented in the roleplay. Let's begin by outlining the main focus of Section 4.0. Section 4.0's main focus is to ensure that all behaviour analysts take accountability for all parts of intervention programmes. This includes, but is not limited to, the creation of the concept of the programme, putting the interventions in place, and finally ensuring the interventions are eventually put on extinction. Now that you have some background information, let's take a more in-depth look at the subsections. Now Tia is going to provide an in-depth description of subsections 4.06 and 4.07.
Section 4.06 of the code is about defining circumstances that will help the program to be effective and successful. This means that the behavior analysis is responsible for explaining to the client what specific environmental conditions are essential for the intervention program to be effective for the client. Subsection 4.07 is focused on settings that could act as barriers for the intervention programs being put into place. As in situations where environmental settings inhibit the execution of an intervention program, behavior analysis have the responsibility to propose that other kinds of specialized supports be pursued. This could include consultation or therapeutic intervention by other specialists. In the situation where environmental conditions obstruct the implementation of an intervention program, behavior analysis must attempt to remove the environmental barriers or identify in writing ways to remove the barriers that are preventing the program from being put into place. Now, Kailey is going to provide an overview of the contents in subsection 4.08 and 4.09.
Section 4.08 of the code is about aversive methods and all the considerations that must be made when thinking of using aversive methods in a behavior change program. Section 4.08 has 4 main points I am going to highlight. The first is, as professionals, behavior analysts have the responsibility, whenever it is possible to do so, to suggest the use of reinforcement-based methods over the use of aversive methods. Secondly, punishment procedures should always be a last resort and are only to be used if absolutely necessary. If they are necessary, then reinforcement methods for correct behaviors must also be included in the punishment-based intervention program. The third point is, prior to punishment procedures being used, behavior analysts ensure they have taken the time and effort to attempt to create and implement an individualized reinforcement-based program. The only exception to this is if an individual's behavior is dangerous, such as a self-injurious behavior, thus requiring the instantaneous use of unpleasant stimuli to reduce the behavior. The fourth point is, if punishment procedures are being used, they must be implemented by an individual who is expertly trained. The individual must be supervised at all times while implementing the procedures, and all punishment-based behavior change programs must include to withdraw and eventually fully stop the use of punishment procedures. This point also includes that data must be taken while implementing aversive procedures. Now, let's look at subsection 4.09. which is about least restrictive methods. The main point in subsection 4.09 is the behavior analysts have the professional responsibility to be able to evaluate, understand, and implement the least physically restrictive procedures that will also be successful in situations that require the use of these procedures. That is it for subsection 4.08 and 4.09. Now, Claire will be covering the last 2 subsections of the code.
Subsection 4.10 is focused on ensuring hazardous and/or hurtful reinforcers are not used, and these considerations are made on an individual basis. As it is important that behaviour analysts keep in mind the health and developmental implications of potential reinforcers when choosing them. It would be unethical to choose reinforcers which are potentially damaging in these ways, even if they would be good reinforcers. Also keep in mind that what's harmful to one person may not apply to all individuals. There will be more about this particular issue to come, as this is also the subsection we have chosen to act out through our roleplay, which will follow this overview of the subsections. Lastly, subsection 4.11 regards stopping intervention programmes properly and in an appropriate timeframe. Behaviour analysts should be able to decide upon the correct criteria for when a behaviour change programme has met its specified goals for a client and be able to clearly explain and discuss this with the client. It is also imperative that behaviour analysts fully understand this criteria and continue to measure data throughout the programme to properly ascertain when the criteria has been met. At this point, the programme should be discontinued. That concludes our overview of our assigned subsections. We will now move on to our roleplay presentation on section 4.10.
For context, the role play will be highlighting how a behavior analyst is explicitly ignoring the request of a client's parents to not use candy and other foods high in calories or sugars as a form of reinforcement, as their daughter, the client, is pre-diabetic. The client is 13 years of age, has high-functioning autism, and the main goal of the ABA sessions is to reduce the client's non-compliance behaviors when asked to do chores or schoolwork. The parents noted that it may be tempting to use candy as a reinforcer for their child, as they are highly motivated by candy. But the parents also provided the behavior analysts with other items, such as stuffed animals and bouncy balls, that would be good options for potential reinforcers other than food. The behavior analyst takes note of this, ensuring the parents that food and candy will not be used at all as a form of reinforcement during the preference assessment. The following scene will show the preference assessment that was conducted with Tia, the client, and Claire, the behavior analyst.
Hey Tia, how are you today?
Hi, I'm okay. What are we doing today?
Okay, so today you get to choose what type of candies you like the most from the ones that I'm going to present to you. How does that sound?
That sounds great. I love candy, but my parents don't like me eating candy because of my diet and health concerns.
Yeah, I'm aware. But you don't have to worry. I've already cleared that up with them and I've made sure your parents are okay with it. I promise.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to give you 4 different types of candy, and when I say pick one, you can tell me which one you like best. Do you understand?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Pick one.
That one.
Pick one.
That one.
Pick one.
That one.
Well, that's it. Great job. That's going to be the end of our session today, and I'll see you tomorrow.
Okay, thank you. Bye. See you tomorrow. The therapist Claire receives an email from her supervisor Kailey about an hour after the session finished. Kailey has set up a Zoom meeting with Claire to discuss some issues that were brought up by the parents with her client Tia.
Hi there, Claire. I'd like to speak to you about your client Tia and the therapy session that occurred today.
Okay, is there a problem?
Yes, in fact, there is. First, I'd like to ask you a few questions. Did you collect the necessary data required before conducting a preference assessment?
Yeah, I did. I did an FAI with the parents and other indirect assessments such as a QEBF and an FAST.
Okay, that's great to hear. And did the parents note any specific items they did not want to be used as reinforcers for their child's sessions?
Yeah, the parents noted they didn't want to use food as a reinforcer at all. Specifically, food high in sugar and high in calories weren't to be used.
Okay, so knowing that information, can you please explain to me why you use candy for your preference assessment today with this client when you also know the client is pre-diabetic and on a strict nutritional diet plan?
Well, I didn't know what else to use, and the parents didn't give me any alternatives.
Well, I looked over the client's file, and in the FAI data you took, the parents make it quite clear that food of any kind is not to be used at all, and they did list alternatives. I suggest that you review the other options the parents listed as things that could be reinforcing for your client.
Okay, I'll do that. I just thought because the client liked candy, it would be easy and make a good reinforcer.
Yes, well, the easy way is not always the right way or the correct way. I hope you also realize you violated a portion of the behavior analyst ethical code. Do you know what section I'm talking about?
Yeah, I violated subsection 4.10 of the code, which is avoiding harmful reinforcers. I did the exact opposite of that.
Yes, I'm glad you can see and acknowledge your mistakes. Now, what are you going to do to fix your mistakes and also learn from them?
Firstly, I'm going to apologise to the parents and to my client. And secondly, I'm going to review my data and find other items that could be reinforcing. And then I'll redo the preference assessment properly with my client.
That sounds like a great start. But understand you have broken trust with your client and the client's parents, and thus you must respect if they no longer wish to work with you.
Yeah, I understand that. I should have acted more professionally and not looked for the easy option.
For context, the BA has called the parents and apologized. The parents accepted the apology and are still willing to work with Claire as she owned up to her mistakes and would like to fix them with the proper supervision. Claire now calls her supervisor back to inform her and to go over how she would have acted from the start.
Hi, I just called the parents and they're willing to give me another chance.
That's great to hear. So I would like to go over how you think you should have done this from the very start.
I should have taken the data that I took into consideration, as well as taken into consideration that using candy could potentially harm my client's health even more. It was ultimately unethical of me to continue on with the preference assessment using candy and not trying anything else, especially considering the parents did give me alternatives.
Great, that's exactly what I was looking to hear. So, since you are going to do the preference assessment over again from the start, what are you going to use this time?
I'll start by obtaining the other items that the parents listed in the FAI that could be potential reinforcers, such as tangible items like bouncy balls or stuffies, like they said, that the client might enjoy.
Exactly, that is perfect.
Yeah, I've learned it's better to take the hard way rather than the easy way and not to put my client's health at risk.
I am glad you have learned from your mistakes. I am excited to see the preference assessment redone, as I will be there to supervise. But I have faith and you will be just fine.
Thank you for helping me fix my mistake and for giving me a chance to learn from it.
You are welcome. Have a good night, Claire.
You too. Bye.
The behavior analyst made a poor ethical decision from the start, as she chooses to ignore the parents' wishes and put her client's health at risk. The therapist did the correct action by owning up to her wrongdoings and apologizing. She also was able to recognize how she should have acted from the start. The therapist outlined that she should have found and used alternative reinforcers, as this was the ethical thing to do from the very beginning, and that the easy way out is never the right or ethical thing to do. We hope you enjoyed our role play. Thank you for watching.
In this section of our presentation, we will outline how the moral philosophy of classical utilitarianism relates to our role play, and then we will go on to discuss some Ontario legislation which is relevant to this scenario. To begin, the moral philosophy of classical utilitarianism defines the ultimate goal of human actions as creating the most happiness for all. Happiness can be defined as a life free from pain and suffering. Therefore, the overall concept of utilitarianism is to keep our lives and the lives of others as free from pain and suffering as we possibly can. The basic theory was created by Jeremy Bentham, and later it was refined by John Stuart Mill. Mill was the person who named the theory as utilitarianism, and he is the person most commonly associated with the theory. Mill believes it is not just our own happiness that we must strive for, but also the happiness of others. Thus, any actions we take should produce the most amount of happiness possible for the greatest possible number of people. Kailey is now going to explain how this relates to our roleplay.
This relates to our role play, as the ultimate goal of the instructor is the happiness of the client and their family. Therefore, the therapist should have taken more consideration when choosing possible reinforcers. The actions the therapist chose to make produced negative consequences and unhappiness for all individuals involved. The therapist broke trust with the client and the family and also put the client's health at risk. Due to the poor decision-making we saw in the role play, this shows how the therapist's actions went against utilitarianism. This role play can also be looked at from the viewpoint of act utilitarianism. The specific act of the therapist considering the level of happiness that will come about from using a potentially harmful reinforcer. In this case, it is candy. Candy may lead to an initial happiness from the client, but later unhappiness due to health problems being exacerbated, as well as unhappiness from the family as their instructions were ignored, and from the employee supervisor. Now, Tia is going to talk about the relevant legislation.
The legislation which we felt was most relevant to our roleplay is the Personal Health Information Protection Act. The main reason for the creation of this act was to give individuals more control over how their own personal data is collected, used, and disclosed. It also includes points on how a person is able to give and remove consent for procedures at any time. The therapist in our scenario would have been given access to information about the client's health conditions and therefore would have been bound by this act to keep this information confidential and to plan the treatment accordingly. The therapist would have also been accountable for ensuring that the safety and health of the client was upheld throughout the treatment, as they are aware of this client's medical history. Furthermore, when the therapist told the client that their parents have given her permission to use candy, the therapist is giving false consent, lying to her client, and these actions strictly goes against this act. These actions by the therapist also took away the client's ability to remove their consent, as they felt bound to what they believed that their parents have said. Now Kailey is going to talk briefly about one other act we felt applicable to this situation.
Finally, to briefly mention one other piece of legislation we felt would be applicable to this particular situation is the Child and Family Services Act. We believe this to be applicable to our scenario which we created, as it was an act created solely with the purpose of protecting the well-being and best interests of children. Unfortunately, the therapist in our scenario was in breach of this code, as the way in which they progressed with the preference assessment showed us that they were not entirely acting in the child's best interest. The therapist should have found other alternatives reinforcers which would have been suitable for this child's and client's particular needs. That is it for our role play and our presentation on the subsections and relevant legislation. We hope you enjoyed and also learned lots along the way. We have also included some links here if you would like to learn more about the BACB code.